Hello, welcome everyone once again to another version of Humanities in Action. My name is Max Orr. I'm the Executive Director for Carolina Public Humanities, and it's my delight to welcome you to another edition of Humanities in Action, this series of talks on contemporary and potentially, well, controversial issues, depending on what they are. Before we begin, I want to thank a few people. Of course, our sponsors, the Cotton Merca Group at Morgan Stanley, have been helping us with our K-12 programs for a number of years. We're grateful for their support. Carolina Meadows, a sponsor of our public programming as a retirement community in Chapel Hill, and we're also, of course, very grateful for their support and sponsorship. The North Carolina Yana Society, a wonderful partner in producing teacher workshops with us, including the William Friday Teachers Retreat, a very special initiative that we have with Carolina K-12. And finally, of course, the General Alumni Association partners in promoting, publicizing, and putting on a bunch of programs, including these here today. So if you'd like information on any of those groups, we have materials at our desk right here for the folks in-house. And for all of those of you out in the ether, we have Paul will be dropping some links in to give you information on our sponsors. I also want to thank, of course, Flyleaf Books, providing us with this great space. Let's put our hands together for Flyleaf Books. I always say a true sign of civilization is a functioning and thriving independent bookstore, and we're delighted to have this partner. Flyleaf Books has been our studio even when we didn't have people in-house like this, so they've been just great partners throughout all of this COVID business and even before. And of course, we must thank Paul Bonici back there doing all the technological work. Thank you, Paul, for everything that you've done throughout all this and for helping us today, and of course, Vicki Breeden, who does all the logistics. Yeah, keep it coming, absolutely. My name, of course, Max Orr. I'm the Executive Director. I do not need any applause for that. I just want to quickly let you know what Carolina Public Humanities is, who we are, and what we do if you're not aware. I'm looking around this room and I see maybe one or two people who don't know, but I'll let them know. We are the public outreach arm for the College of Arts and Sciences, and it's our job to make sure that scholarship and faculty at UNC are shared with diverse communities throughout the state. And of course, we do that through these programs, public programs, but we also, and I'll mention a couple of those in just a moment, we also, of course, do that through our extensive K-12 outreach organization, Carolina K-12. Of course, we have an extensive community college outreach as well. So Paul will be dropping links to some of our programming. You can always go to humanities.unc.edu to find out more about us. And we certainly welcome if you are interested in giving to Carolina Public Humanities to help us with those aspects of our program that aren't tuition based or ticket based. So all of our teacher workshops, all of our community colleges, we're grateful for any support that you could give us if you're interested in giving. And Paul will be dropping that in there. And if you're interested today in the house, you can talk to me. We certainly are grateful for you considering your support. We want to get right onto our program, but I do want to mention a few upcoming things. First of all, we're in the middle of our Lunch with Friends and Strangers, our biography program. It's been just great fun. This is an online program. It happens at 12 o'clock on Fridays, in which I sit down with a scholar and they bring someone of interest to talk about. So far this semester, we've done activist Mary Jean Collins, musician Arsenio Rodriguez, Babe Ruth, you might have heard of him, singer-actress Hazel Scott, and coming up on this Friday, we have Kemal Ataturk, some say the father of modern Turkey. I think that's a fair description. And that'll be with Professor Chamil Aydin. Should be a very interesting conversation. Upcoming Adventures and Ideas weekend seminars include the Book of Revelation with Bart Ehrman. So very popular religious studies scholar talking about the Book of Revelation. And if you think you know it, come on Saturday and you'll realize you don't know it, because that's what Bart Ehrman does. And finally, I just want to remind folks, we are in the middle of our Humanities in Action series. Right in the middle of it. Next, we have 3 more talks after today on social media and democracy next Wednesday. Following Wednesday will be critical race theory and the law. And finally, on October 27th, we wrap up with teaching hard history. And that'll actually be really wonderful because we'll invite Christy Norris, who actually runs Carolina K-12, and she can talk about what this is like teaching difficult subjects in this state. So check those out. Paul will be putting links in humanities.unc.edu. Of course, for everybody in-house, we have flyers over there, these very flyers. Not these ones, although I will give them to you if you want. But let's get right to introducing our speaker. Alex Worsnip is an associate professor of philosophy here at Carolina. He is a product of Oxford University and did his PhD at Yale and spent a year at NYU before joining us here in at Chapel Hill. He is the author of numerous peer-reviewed articles, and I know Paul will be dropping some of the links to Professor Worsnip's work in the links there. But he also has a forthcoming book from Oxford University Press, Fitting Things Together, Coherence and the Demands of Structural Rationality. It flows right off my tongue, I'll get that. But we're really interested, I just want to give a little history of how Alex is here today. I reached out to talk about, we wanted to put this whole program this fall about misinformation or what the truth is in society. And bingo, Alex this semester is teaching political epistemology and democratic theory. So for a philosophical perspective on what is the truth, we thought that would be a very important person to come and ask and figure out how this works in a very heated political climate. I'm very excited to learn from Professor Worsnip. Please welcome Alex Worsnip.
Thanks so much, and thanks for coming, and thanks to everyone who's joining online as well. So, until a few years ago, if I told people that I work on epistemology, no one knew what I meant. And to some extent, that's still true. But in the last 5 years or so, there's been perhaps surprising flurry of public interest in this topic and of use of this phrase about America's epistemological, or sometimes epistemic, crisis. So to prove that this really is something that isn't just something that professors of philosophy are saying, here's some examples. So in Vox magazine, for example, there was a headline, "America is facing an epistemic crisis." That was a story in 2017, and then a couple of years later, "With impeachment, America's epistemic crisis has arrived." In the New York Times, a column by David Brooks. Just in the middle of that column, he said, "We live in a country in epistemological crisis in which much of the Republican Party has become detached from reality." Huffington Post, "Our epistemological crisis." The Atlantic, in an interview with Barack Obama, entitled "Why Obama Fears for Our Democracy," this is actually Obama speaking here. He says, "If we do not have the capacity to distinguish what's true from what's false, then by definition the marketplace of ideas doesn't work, and by definition our democracy doesn't work. We are entering into an epistemological crisis." So this is even something you're hearing from a former president of the United States. I turned on NPR after Joe Biden's inauguration and started hearing them talking about the epistemological themes that Joe Biden had touched on in his inauguration address. So this is something, a phrase that is getting around. But what is an epistemological crisis, and how can the philosophical study of epistemology illuminate it? So epistemology is the philosophical study of knowledge and related notions like belief, evidence, justification, and rationality. It asks questions like, when do beliefs count as knowledge? When do beliefs count as rational? On what grounds can beliefs be rational? On what grounds can they be irrational? And so on. When should we count a certain piece of thinking as irrational rather than rational, or vice versa? And because this is a branch of philosophy, we're primarily interested here in conceptual and normative questions rather than empirical questions. So that's to say, we're not necessarily, as philosophers, trying to solve problems that, well, why do people believe what they believe? That's, of course, a very important question, but it's one that you can only settle with the methods of social science, with data. Rather, we are interested in questions that come before that. So, you know, a lot of psychologists like to collect lots of data on how irrational we are, but before you can collect that data, you have to ask the question, what is rationality? Why would a certain way of thinking or a certain kind of belief count as irrational rather than rational? What justifies us in saying that the people who respond in certain ways are being irrational? So that's the kind of question that epistemologists are interested in. Okay, so what's an epistemological crisis? Well, we can get a little bit more precise about what this is by considering a simple, perhaps even simplified, model. So, well, before we get to that more precise model, let me try and say what I think the term refers to most of the time in these op-eds and things like that that we were seeing the headlines on that first slide. So it seems most often to refer to the idea that our society is characterized by deep disagreement, not just in values, but about basic matters of fact. So some examples, there's not in contemporary American society widespread consensus among ordinary people about whether anthropogenic climate change is occurring or at what rate it's occurring. There is not in contemporary American society widespread consensus on whether the 2020 election was free and fair among ordinary people. There is not widespread consensus about whether the COVID-19 vaccine is safe. This is among ordinary people, right? So when I say there's not widespread consensus, I mean that there is widespread disagreement about these issues. There are significant numbers of people who believe that the 2020 election was not free and fair. There are significant numbers of people who believe that anthropogenic climate change is not happening. There are significant numbers of people who believe that the COVID-19 vaccine is not safe among ordinary people, right? And so these are kind of basic matters of fact, but our society is characterized by deep disagreement about them. That seems to be the idea that people most often have in mind when they talk about the idea of being in an epistemological crisis, that we don't have consensus about basic matters of fact like these. And the thought is, we can't even begin to have a conversation about what the solutions to things like climate change or COVID or the electoral system should be if we can't agree on these basic facts about it first. Okay. And it's also associated, this idea of an epistemological crisis, with a number of other concepts and buzzwords that we've been hearing basically since 2016 or so. So alternative facts, fake news, post-truth, all of these terms seem to be bound up with the idea of an epistemological crisis. We'll dig deeper into a couple of these later on. Okay, so as I said, we can get a little bit more precise if we consider a sort of simple model about how people form political opinions. So, you know, on a very simple model, people have beliefs about certain matters of fact on one hand, and then they have values and preferences on the other hand, and then those come together to produce their overall views about political questions. And then in turn, that produces political behavior, like decisions about who to vote for or what kind of other political action to take. So, you know, to give an example, you might have a belief that a belief about a matter of fact that an increase in the minimum wage will make the poorest better off, and you might hold the value that we ought to prioritize the well-being of the poorest people in society. And then those might come together, right? Those are different. The first is just a belief about a matter of fact that an increase in the minimum wage would have a certain economic effect. The second is a value, something about what you think is important, what you think we ought to prioritize as a society. And they might come together to produce an overall view about a political question, namely, in this case, say that we should increase the minimum wage, right? And then that, in turn, influences your political behavior, the way you vote, kinds of activism you might engage in, and so on. Or, of course, it could be we use the same model for people with the opposite view. So, the belief could be that an increase in the belief about a matter of fact could be that an increase in the minimum wage will increase unemployment. The value could be that we should prioritize avoiding unemployment, and then the overall view should be that we should not increase the minimum wage. Okay, so that's a very kind of simple model of how people form overall views about political questions. And on a kind of just so story, which, you know, we can ask about whether this is historically accurate or not, kind of in the good old days, or something like that, basically people disagreed about this stuff, they had disagreements in values, but there was sort of at least fairly widespread consensus about the kind of basic matters of fact. And, you know, so the values might differ, and so they might vote differently, but the kind of basic facts were agreed on. It's not clear if that historical just so story is really true, but that's how it goes. And on the continuation of that story, the sort of worry is that, well, now people disagree even about the basic matters of fact. Or at least, perhaps to be a little bit less historically cavalier, the amount of disagreement about the basic matters of fact has increased over time. Okay, and more particularly, the disagreement about the facts often lines up with partisan political affiliation. So people who support one political party are much more likely to think that anthropogenic climate change is happening. People who support the other political party are much less likely to think that it's happening. People who support one political party are much more likely to think that the COVID-19 vaccine works and is safe and effective. People who support the other one are much less likely to think that, and so on and so on. So this disagreement about basic matters of fact is sort of following or correlating with people's political partisan affiliation. Okay. So that's the kind of basic idea of an epistemological crisis. I'll make things a little bit more complicated later on, but that's something to be getting on with for the idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about an epistemological crisis. Okay, so let's now explore the question of what underlies this epistemological crisis. So this is a very complex question, and it requires some engagement with data and with social science, and I'm not going to be able to answer it comprehensively, but I can at least point to a few things. So one thing is this. It seems that at least some of the time people are arriving at the beliefs that are convenient for their values, or their values kind of in some way impinge upon their beliefs about the facts. So let's go back to that simple model that I gave you just a minute ago. What seems to be happening at least some of the time is that people's values and preferences are themselves in some way producing people's beliefs about matters of fact. And there's a term for this in the psychological literature. It's called cultural cognition. Whether that's the name for it is debatable, but that's a name that's come to have. And the person who's done the most to popularize this term is Dan Kahan, who's at Yale Law School, but he's a social scientist. He's a sort of social psychologist. So we can define cultural cognition, roughly speaking, as letting your values and preferences determine your beliefs about matters of fact. And most typically what happens here is that you form the beliefs that are convenient given your the beliefs about matters of fact that are convenient given your values and preferences. And they're convenient in two ways. Firstly, in that they reinforce those values and preferences, and secondly, in that they allow you to avoid psychologically uncomfortable trade-offs. I'll illustrate this with an example in a moment. But the final point, just before I get to that example, is that the process of cultural cognition is said to occur via what is sometimes called motivated reasoning. So what that involves is your desire to form a particular belief subconsciously biases the way in which you gather and process evidence. So it makes you focus on the evidence that supports the belief that you subconsciously want to form, and discount, or maybe just fully ignore, the evidence that seems to point the other way. Okay, so here, to make this a little less abstract, here are some examples. So plausibly, this is what's going on in the case of a lot of climate change denial. So people have a certain political outlook, say one that emphasizes small government, that says it's better if the government in general does not get too involved in people's affairs. It's better in general if government regulation is kept to a minimum, right? That's a kind of value outlook. Okay, now, given that value outlook, notice, has no bearing on whether it's true that climate change is occurring or anthropogenic climate change is occurring, right? The idea that government should be small does not resolve whether climate change is occurring, right? That's a scientific question. It's not resolved by thinking about whether we should have small government. Nevertheless, for someone who wants to defend the idea that we should have small government and who is attached to that belief and wants to hang on to it, there's a sense in which accepting the reality of anthropogenic climate change could be inconvenient, right? Because if anthropogenic climate change is happening, that's likely to call for, or to seem to call for, significant government regulation and significant government involvement in regulating people's activities. And so if you already have this prior value set which says, I don't like government regulation, you have a kind of motive to deny that climate change is happening in the first place, right? So that's an example of letting your values and preferences determine your beliefs about matters of empirical fact. Here's another example which is a little bit less politically partisan in that it cuts both ways. This is a famous study by some psychologists in the late 70s about beliefs about the effect of the death penalty, right? So in this study, people were presented with different evidence about whether the death penalty is an effective deterrent of crime. And they were presented with different studies, one that seemed to suggest that it was an effective deterrent and one that suggested that it wasn't, together with some methodological critiques of those studies. And they were asked to evaluate those studies and to say what they thought of the evidence that they had been presented with. And what we find, and this is not surprising if you think that cultural cognition is a thing, is that people who antecedently think that the death penalty is unjust tended to interpret the evidence as saying that the death penalty was not an effective deterrent either. And similarly, people who were ahead of time inclined to say that the death penalty is just were inclined to interpret that very same data as suggesting that the death penalty is an effective deterrent, right? So it seems very much that what's going on there is people who are letting their prior values about whether the death penalty is just or unjust affect the way in which they process the evidence about this matter of fact, which is, does the death penalty effectively deter crime? And this seemed to be something that people on both sides of the issue were prone to doing. Okay. There are obviously complex questions to be asked here, but I think in general it's safe to say that this kind of process of cultural cognition is irrational. Why? Well, because, as I've kind of already pointed out, these prior values don't really have any bearing on these matters of fact. Whether a libertarian political outlook is the right political outlook does not have any bearing on whether climate change is happening. So if you let your belief about that matter of fact be determined by your values, then it seems like you're doing something irrational. It's also the case that, if what's happening here is that you're discounting some evidence and paying less attention to it and trying to explain it away and focusing only on the evidence that supports your own views, then you're giving too much weight to some evidence and not enough to other evidence. So that's another reason to think that, in general, cultural cognition is an irrational phenomenon. Okay, and as I've already highlighted with the death penalty example, and there's been a lot more psychological work on this to confirm this effect, cultural cognition affects people of all different political persuasions and ideologies. Okay, so how does this help to explain our epistemological crisis? Well, the thought would be something like this, that as people's values and preferences make more divergent beliefs about matters of fact convenient for them, we can expect to see more disagreement about those matters of fact due to cultural cognition. So as the world evolves in a way such that people's values will make different beliefs about matters of fact convenient for them depending on what their different values are, we can expect to see more disagreement about beliefs about matters of fact. Okay. Now, what we've said so far about cultural cognition can help to shed light, I think, on this idea of post-truth that is, one of those buzzwords that I mentioned at the start. So here are 4 books, all called post-truth. So there's been like an explosion of these are just the books that have the title post-truth. Then there's like tons more books with the phrase post-truth somewhere else in the title. So there's been an explosion of trendy kind of trade books on the topic of post-truth over the last few years. And it was the word of the year for Oxford dictionaries a few years ago. They added it to the Oxford Dictionary and declared it their word of the year. Okay, but what is it? Okay, so sometimes it's presented as the idea that people don't care about the truth or evidence when forming political beliefs. They just don't care about the truth. People don't care about the truth, or they don't care about their evidence. But I think this is at least misleading. So if we go back to the phenomenon of cultural cognition, let's focus on this last bit. It occurs via this process where your desire to form a particular belief subconsciously biases the ways you gather and process evidence. So it's not that you just say, hey, I want to believe this, and then you believe it. Right? In general, it's not easy to just believe something at the snap of your fingers like that. Rather, what happens is much more insidious and much more subconscious. So you think you are following the evidence, but the ways in which you are processing the evidence, the ways in which you attend to some evidence and not others, not some pieces of evidence and not others, the ways in which you evaluate what your evidence supports are being colored by what conclusion you want to arrive at. But then we should expect that when you arrive at that conclusion, you'll think that you've been following the evidence. So I think it's not quite right to say that people just don't care about truth or evidence, right? It's rare to find people saying, yeah, here's what I believe, but it's false, or here's what I believe, it's not true, or I believe this, but I have no good evidence for it. Rather, they usually try to explain why they do think that their evidence supports it, right? And so I think just the idea that people just don't care about evidence or truth is not quite right. So rather, people think that their beliefs are getting at the truth. They think that they're following the evidence, but in fact, at least their evaluation of the evidence is being subconsciously biased in a certain way. And that's what we see in, for example, the death penalty example in the study that I mentioned. People on both sides thought that they had evaluated these studies and come to a conclusion about what the evidence supported. But in doing that, they were being influenced by their prior values. Okay, so that's kind of one idea of the notion of post-truth that involves people just not caring about truth or evidence. I don't think that is a very plausible way to think about our current situation. Let's look at the actual dictionary definition now, the one that is in the Oxford Dictionary when they made it the word of the year. So here's what it says. relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So I don't think this is very helpful either. This is the kind of limitation of dictionaries, explicating concepts. So let's think about this a little bit more. So let's go back to the simple model. So there's nothing wrong with people's, I assume here that objective facts is supposed to refer to the things about which we have, matters of fact, things that we have beliefs about, and then emotion and personal belief. I'm not quite sure what personal belief is. That's an unclarity in this definition to me, but I assume that they mean something like people's values and preferences there when they're talking about that kind of thing. But there's nothing. So what they're saying here is that the problem is that objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. But there's nothing wrong, in fact, I want to suggest, with people's values and preferences shaping their views about political questions. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, to the contrary, we need values to arrive views about what political policies should be pursued. If you just have beliefs about matters of fact, that is not going to lead you to any conclusions about what should be done. Right? So, for example, suppose we determine that an increase in the minimum wage, to go back to my minimum wage example, will increase living standards for many workers, but will also slightly increase unemployment. But suppose we've reached that conclusion about what the effects of the minimum wage rise would be. Okay, then should we increase it or not? Well, that doesn't follow straight away just from those beliefs about the matters of fact. You have to have some values or preferences about what are the things we should prioritize, whether we should be more concerned with reducing unemployment or whether we should be more concerned with increasing living standards for the group of workers that will benefit, right? So you can have beliefs about matters of fact, but you still need values and preferences in order to arrive at views about political questions and what should be done. So I don't think it really points to a problem to say that there's some kind of issue with appeals to emotion and personal belief making a difference to people's political views. Rather, what is a problem is when their values and preferences affect their beliefs about matters of fact, not when they affect their ultimate political views. And this definition doesn't seem to do justice to that. All right. A final thing that I want to explore as underlying our epistemological crisis is what I'll call conflicting epistemic standards. So on a kind of very naive picture of the way that evidence works, if everyone did their best to believe what the evidence supported, we would no longer disagree about matters of fact. Okay, but this picture is mistaken because it's often far from obvious what the evidence supports believing. People can have disagreements about what a shared body of evidence supports believing. And indeed, it can be the case that neither side is making some kind of obvious mistake or error of reasoning in reaching the conclusion they do about what the evidence supports. That's why cultural cognition can take hold, because there's often more than one way of interpreting the evidence. Okay, so we can call these cases where people have disagreement about what the evidence supports cases of conflicting epistemic standards. So, for example, go back to the same sorts of examples we've been talking about. Different people can be aware of all the same evidence regarding whether an increase in the minimum wage will increase unemployment or not, and still disagree about what that evidence supports concluding on balance. People can have access to all the same evidence about whether immigration hurts domestic wages and still disagree about what that evidence supports on balance. They can give different weight to different parts of evidence, putting more weight on some things and less weight on others. There's no kind of simple formula for just saying exactly what the evidence supports in a particular case. Okay, now one source of evidence that's crucial for ordinary people, that is for non-experts when forming beliefs about political issues, is the testimony of others. So none of us can form political beliefs by just directly looking at all the relevant social scientific or scientific data. You know, we don't have time to do that. It's probably not desirable that we do that, since we would not be able to understand it very well. We need to rely on other people and their testimony, that is, on what they say or tell us. Ideally of people who are better able to understand that evidence than we are, but certainly we need to rely on someone. So one especially important way in which our epistemic standards can conflict is when we disagree about whose testimony is worthy of our trust. And these disagreements can be extremely difficult to resolve. So here's a kind of conversation or exchange that you might recognize. So suppose one person says, the New York Times and CNN, so suppose these two people are having a disagreement about whether the COVID-19 vaccine is safe. So one person says, the New York Times and CNN report that the vaccine is safe, right? That's why I think it's safe. And the other one says, well, I don't trust that fake news. So the first person says, well, don't take their word for it. The CDC and Dr. Fauci say that the vaccine is safe too. And the second person says, they're no better. They're all in league with Big Pharma. And then the first person says, well, professors of epidemiology at Harvard and Yale overwhelmingly recommend the vaccine. And the other person says, you expect me to believe those liberal hacks? And then the first person might be getting kind of frustrated and might say, well, why do you think the vaccine is unsafe? Like, what do you have in favor of your view? And they say, well, I've heard about a lot of risks on Tucker Carlson Tonight and Breitbart. And the first person says, well, those aren't reliable sources. And then the second person says, well, how do you know? And the first person says, just check out some neutral fact-checking sites. They detail the falsehoods they spread. And then the second person says, neutral? Those fact-checking sites are designed to protect the liberal establishment media, right? So this kind of conversation is very frustrating, but there's also a deep philosophical problem here too, right? So these two people have very different sets of sources of information that they trust. So the person on the left from this discussion trusts CNN, the New York Times, and Dr. Fauci, and the epidemiologists at Harvard, and the person on the right trusts Tucker Carlson and Breitbart and Donald Trump and perhaps a bevy of people they follow on Twitter. Of course, the person on the left might also have their favorite Twitter commentators as well. Now, as you may have guessed, I personally think that the sources on the left here are much more reliable than the sources on the right. Not perfectly reliable, but much better. But how can I demonstrate that to the person who thinks the opposite? Right? Is there something I can do to, if I'm the person in this conversation here on the left, is there a way I can demonstrate that these sources are more reliable than these ones? It seems that the only way that we could resolve our disagreement is if there's some neutral arbiter that we both trust who can rate the reliability of these different sources of information. But it seems like in the society we live in, there is no neutral arbiter that we both do trust. And in the absence of anything like that, it seems like there's no easily identifiable failure of reasoning that the person on the right here is making. So, we might think they're just wrong about which sources are reliable, but there doesn't seem any way to kind of reason them into accepting that. There doesn't seem to be any kind of obvious mistake of reasoning that the person is making that we can just kind of correct. So although, from my point of view at least, this person on the right here is trusting the wrong sources, the problem doesn't seem to be that they're reasoning in a demonstrably fallacious or irrational way. It's just something like they're kind of stuck in a kind of toxic epistemic environment. And this relates to a problem about expertise. So you might think, okay, well, it's clear what we should do in order to reach accurate beliefs. We should trust the experts. Okay, that seems pretty straightforward. That seems pretty clearly right. Trust the expert seems like unproblematic advice. But what is an expert? So one conception of an expert is what we might call a status conception of expertise. So anyone who just has the status of being an expert, who's just afforded status by other people as an expert. But then trust the experts is actually, at least sometimes, quite bad advice. Some people with the status of experts are not actually very reliable. So consider so-called experts about certain matters that are very hard to predict, like experts in economic forecasting have a pretty bad track record of forecasting economic outcomes, despite their status as experts. You know, an even worse group, although less politically relevant, is like sports pundits who predict sports outcomes. I mean, their overall rate of success is almost no better than chance. I mean, they have a certain status as an expert, but there's really no sense in which it's worth deferring to them. There might be subtler cases as well, like experts in fields where there really are certain ingrained biases in the academic field in question. Some would say that the discipline of economics is like that, for example. Another problem is that we take our scientific experts to be pretty reliable, but for any point in the past, this is a famous problem in the philosophy of science, for any point in the past, it's turned out that those scientific theories have ultimately turned out to be rejected. So most past scientific theories that the experts would have agreed on most times in the past have gone on to be replaced and rejected, and it seems a little hubristic to think that we've now finally reached the point where we've got it all right and that everything, we won't go on to reject the current scientific wisdom. So, you know, that we should just defer to anyone who has the status of an expert seems like it's, at least sometimes, bad advice. But then you might say, okay, so what we really need is a reliability conception of expertise. So instead of understanding an expert as someone who just has a certain kind of status, we should understand an expert as someone who's genuinely reliable about the subject matter that they're said to be an expert about. But if we say that, then the advice becomes very unhelpful. So recall that the advice is trust the experts. And now, yeah, the idea I should trust the experts if they're the reliable people is kind of almost trivial, but how do I identify which experts are reliable? It seems like in order to do that, I have to have some way of measuring their track record. But then, in order to measure their track record, it seems like I already have to have some expertise myself in order to figure out whether the experts are getting it right or not. So, on this way of interpreting trust the experts, it turns out to be kind of unhelpful advice. So all this reinforces how just saying trust the experts doesn't really give us a way to resolve our I think there's a sense in which it's true that we should trust the experts, but it doesn't really give us a way to resolve our differences in epistemic standards. Okay, so back to what an epistemological crisis is. I said I would make this slightly more complicated later on. So earlier on I said that an epistemological crisis refers to the idea that our society is characterized by deep disagreement, not just about values, but about basic matters of fact. And now we might add, it's a situation where that holds, and there doesn't seem to be any neutral shared method for resolving those disagreements. Okay. All right, so finally, navigating this epistemological crisis. So, a couple of preliminary remarks here. So, firstly, there's a contrast that's often drawn between thinking of individual type solutions to these kinds of problems, ways in which individuals should change their practices, the way they form beliefs on one hand, and kind of structural solutions on the other, where you look at institutions and you look at things that the government can do and things that social media sites can do and so on, and not really at the practices of individual people. Now, it may well be right that we can't solve this problem just through the actions of individuals, just through individuals changing their practices. A large amount of the problem is driven by deliberate, pernicious manipulation of information and disinformation, not by kind of individual people's irrationality. And if that's so, we can't solve the problem just as individuals. But having said that, I want to say we still, as individuals, face the question of how to navigate this epistemic environment that we're in and what we should believe in the meantime, while the institutions are getting to work on fixing the problem in whatever way they can do that. And that's so, especially given that, as I mentioned earlier, these issues and problems do affect people on all sides of the political spectrum, right? We find that these phenomena like cultural cognition do affect people on all sides of the political spectrum. Okay, so I certainly can't solve all the problems that I've raised, but I will offer some brief suggestions. So, oh yeah, I've already said this. Okay. All right, so the first is what I'll call self-suspicion. So one thing that I think you should ask yourself is, are the beliefs that I'm adopting about matters of fact suspiciously convenient for my values? So is it the case that whenever I have some particular set of values, my beliefs about matters of fact then just turn out to work out really nicely for them? And if so, that is a reason to become somewhat less confident in your beliefs about those matters of fact, and maybe to reassess. A very closely related point is this. You should ask yourself, given the way that I see things, is there a suspicious absence of trade-offs? Right? So think about newspaper op-eds, right, when they're arguing for a particular policy line. Right? They tend to say, this policy is better, in terms of economic outcomes, it's better in terms of racial justice, it's better morally, it's better, for the worst off, it's better for the best off, etc. It's better in every regard, right? But it would be very surprising if for all political issues, all the different considerations kind of lined up in favor of the same solution. That would just be a very surprising world. Usually we face trade-offs, right? So, I think one thing we really, one problem we really have is a lack of voices of people, and of course this is partly the incentives of contemporary journalism, but we have a lack of people saying things like, well, there are trade-offs here to be faced down. There are difficult trade-offs to be faced, say about immigration policy, for example. One side wants to say immigration is beneficial in every conceivable respect, and the other side wants to say it's harmful in every conceivable respect. But it would be surprising if any particular immigration policy was beneficial in every conceivable respect, or indeed harmful in every conceivable respect. There are usually going to be certain trade-offs. So ask yourself whether there's a suspicious absence of trade-offs given the way you see things. And if so, that's another reason to become less confident. And a final question to ask yourself is, am I picking and choosing the sources that I consult and trust based on whether they confirm what I want to believe? So, I don't think this is necessarily something that can solve that argument between the two people that I mentioned earlier. But one thing that each person could ask themselves is, did I pick these sources because they confirm the things that I already think? So it's not enough to kind of arbitrarily choose one expert who agrees with your point of view, and then say, well, look, this is what this great world-famous expert says, if there are equally world-famous experts saying the opposite thing who you've just chosen not to read, when you decide which book to pick up at the bookstore. Okay. And if your answers to these questions are yes, then there's a good chance that your beliefs are being influenced by motivated reasoning or by cultural cognition. And if they are, that's some reason to be less confident in your beliefs. And also, I think, to diversify your sources, to look at a wider range of sources of information that will expose you to different points of view. Second thing I'll talk about is what is often referred to as epistemic humility. So there are 2 points here. So one is, don't try to evaluate evidence that you're not competent to interpret. So here I think the climate change example really is a good one. So I've written a little bit about the epistemology of climate change, and occasionally I get emails from people who are usually climate change deniers saying, well, how could you write this paper in which you say that climate change denial is irrational? Look at this very, very complex set of data that I've been trying to analyze myself. How do you explain this, or how do you explain that? How do you explain this complex pattern in the change of the Earth's atmosphere where it actually hasn't been going consistently up, and all these complications, right? And a lot of these people have actually tried to look at the evidence. Maybe this is just a selection bias of the people who bother to write an email, but a lot of these people have actually tried to look at the evidence, the scientific data for themselves. But they're not scientists, right? They're not people who actually really have the competence to evaluate that data. And then they're asking questions about it like, well, my interpretation of this data is that it doesn't really support the thesis of anthropogenic climate change, or how do you explain this, or how do you explain that, right? And I can't rebut those people's direct scientific arguments because I'm not a climate change scientist. I think the only answer I can give to those people is, you just made a mistake in the first place of even trying to evaluate this evidence for yourself. You went down the wrong path in the first place trying to figure it out yourself. If you're not competent to evaluate a certain kind of evidence, you shouldn't try to evaluate it. And then the other thing within epistemic humility is, remember that you don't have to be fully opinionated about everything. Sometimes it's appropriate and responsible to suspend judgment. So philosophers refer to suspending judgment as meaning forming a belief neither way about a particular issue, just remaining undecided, right? I think it's a feature of at least parts of the society we live in. There are like parts of Twitter where you've got to have an opinion about everything, and if you don't speak out about each thing that happens, that's a sort of gap in your commentary or something like that. It's almost like how a paid newspaper columnist has to opine on everything from week to week, regardless of whether they know anything about it. Similarly, now there are certain people on Twitter who are just ordinary people who are treating themselves the same way. They've got to have an opinion about every issue that arises, right? But I think it's important to remember you don't have to be fully opinionated about everything. Sometimes it is appropriate and responsible to just remain undecided. Sometimes we don't have good enough evidence to form a clear belief. Okay, and then finally, modeling epistemic virtue. So being epistemically virtuous is just having good epistemic practices, having good belief-forming practices. So be charitable in interpreting others. So don't give people don't interpret them in the worst way possible, or don't interpret their beliefs or views in the worst way possible. But also don't be an epistemic hypocrite. So don't engage in the exact same practices that you accuse your opponents of engaging in. So if you accuse them of picking and choosing their experts just to confirm their prior opinions, don't do exactly the same thing yourself. don't, if you accuse them of ignoring certain data in order to fit a narrative, don't do the same thing yourself. So model good epistemic practices. So those are my suggestions. As I said, I don't think that these things can provide a panacea for the epistemological crisis we're in, but we do face this question of how to form beliefs and how to go about managing our beliefs in our everyday lives. And I think if we followed some of these suggestions, we would at least go some distance towards reducing our tensions. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Worsnip. We have some questions online, but I want to open up questions for the floor. And learning our lesson from previous weeks, I will come with the microphone if you have a question for Dr. Worsnip. Okay, we'll start over here with Bob.
I'm struck that you skipped the part, just to take the death penalty example, that it assumes that the people who are writing the article have no opinion, that they are just experts on the facts, as opposed to who writes the article probably has a slant on what they believe about the death penalty before they started the study. That what I would call a non-malignant bias that's already there in advance. My larger concern is the expert, Tucker Carlson, for example, or Facebook in the current iteration of what's happening in Congress, that wants more clicks, more attention, the more hate, intensity, emotion that's stirred up, so that the issue may or may not be what they believe or they're expert in, but it has a hidden agenda of trying to get people to get stirred up, get interested, watch their show. That isn't the issue itself, it's the involvement of an emotional to keep the audience coming. Comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those points are good ones. On the point about the death penalty study, I mean, the people conducting the study didn't portray themselves as being experts about the death penalty. They're experts about psychology, right? So they're psychologists who wanted to test whether these patterns of motivated reasoning affect people on both sides of the political spectrum. Now, could they have brought their own biases and their own views about the death penalty to that study? Sure, of course they could have. That may well have happened. May well happen in some of these cases. You know, in that particular case, I think their incentive was not really to confirm. It's not like their study lent direct support either to pro or anti-death penalty views. Rather, what it did is it suggested that regardless of your views on that issue, you can be subject to a certain kind of cultural cognition or motivated reasoning. So I'm not sure that their study ended up kind of reinforcing any particular political conclusion about the death penalty. But of course, sometimes researchers do have vested political interests, and you know, you hope that other people will look at their studies and see if there were flaws in the way that they were set up, or see if there were ways that the conceptual space was carved up that didn't do justice to the issues, or methodological flaws in the way the study was run, and then other people will run their studies, and that you'll get kind of progress over time. Of course, if a whole field is biased, then that may not work out either. But you know, in the case of this social psychology stuff, you know, I feel relatively confident that people's biases about the death penalty weren't. There's a huge amount of evidence that this kind of thinking affects people on both sides of the political spectrum, and I think that that's not just the outcome of the biases of the researchers. Should I try and address the second part of the question too? Sure. Yeah, so the second point was about Tucker Carlson and other, you know, presumably it's not just Tucker Carlson, you know, other figures who, you know, are really just looking for more attention, and there are certain incentives, right? So they they have an incentive to put out certain kinds of information or misinformation, because that kind of misinformation is attention grabbing and it gets them more clicks or it gets them more advertising and so on. And yeah, I totally take that point. And that's kind of what I was alluding to towards the end when I said some of the solutions to this are in terms of how we as individuals can do better with our beliefs, and others are in terms of structural solutions like how to regulate the media or whatever, right? And on the latter things, you know, I really, as a philosopher, don't have a lot to contribute, but I think we still face the questions of how to form beliefs as individuals in the meantime. It's also a really interesting question, like, does Tucker Carlson really believe the things he says? Very hard to speculate on. I mean, you know, it's a psychological question about what's going on inside Tucker Carlson's head. You know, I think some people are very quick to assume he definitely doesn't. You know, he's just peddling stuff he knows is false for self-interested reasons. You know, I think there's also, you know, given all these results about the extent to which we can engage in motivated reasoning, I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, yes, it is in his interest to push these things, but then, you know, that causes him to really convince himself of some of it. But this is speculation. You know, we really can't know what's going on inside his head.
Great. Let's take another question from the in-house audience, and then we'll go to some questions from virtual and bounce back and forth.
I come from a sociology background, so I tend to look at large structural realities. Do people in your area study the simple impact of growing social heterogeneity, especially for normative issues, as well as the growing degree of specialization in different fields of expertise over time, and how both of these things can have a disenfranchising effect on average people's agency in trying to understand the world?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Starting with the second phenomenon you identified, specialization. There has been some recent work on this. There's a book by a philosopher named Elijah Milgram called The Great Endowment, where he basically argues that the extent to which almost every aspect of human life, and certainly every aspect of political policy making, has become so technical and so specialized, has put knowledge about more than a tiny fraction of these things out of the grasp of almost everyone, and that this is a huge problem for us as kind of participants in a society and a democracy. So yeah, there has been some work on that by philosophers, and I think those points really feed into the problems about expertise that I was discussing before, right? So one thing Milgram argues is, he makes the point that I made about how it's hard to identify who is truly a reliable expert and who isn't unless you already have some expertise yourself. But because of the increasing specialization required to understand any field, it's very hard to identify who the experts are, and so you face a problem. So I think there's a relationship there. And in terms of heterogeneity, so I take it your idea there was that just in terms as people's values change, as we get more and more social difference, we're going to get more difference in values, right? In that simple model that I had at the start, it would be the values moving apart. Yeah, I mean, I think those questions really are questions for social scientists, sociologists, not for philosophers to speculate about from the armchair. And does it threaten people if they feel that a certain percentage of the world simply doesn't support you? Yeah, right. So, you know, but I do think that it would, I mean, again, that would help to explain why people were becoming more, if this phenomenon of cultural cognition is real. So if people's values and preferences do shape their beliefs about matters of fact in this not particularly rational way, then of course increasing disagreement about values would in turn produce increasing disagreement about matters of fact. So I do think that idea ties in with what I was suggesting, but you know, all of this stuff has to be studied empirically by social scientists to really be able to know the scale of these effects.
Online here, David Scott is curious about the effect of religion on believing the unbelievable and allowing people to perhaps discredit critical thinking. Is there any way in which you can incorporate religious belief into values and how it affects our ability to believe the unbelievable?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, right, so I mean, religion might come in a couple of different ways, right? So it might come in terms of difference in values, so you might have different ethical perspectives based on your religion, and that might play into the kind of model I was giving earlier. I also think that, you know, a very obvious way in which religion comes into all of this is in terms of the conflicting epistemic standards I was talking about, right? So, you know, people have, I didn't put in my little toy disagreement between those two people, see if I can get back to it. I didn't put, here we go. You know, I didn't put God on either side, you know, you know, obviously when people believe that the ultimate source of authority, the ultimate expert to defer to is a deity or a religious text, that is even harder to resolve, right? I mean, you know, because it's almost by definition there's no further thing that could assess the reliability of the religious text. Remember I said that in order to resolve this disagreement, we'd need like some further person who could neutrally assess which of these was the more accurate set of sources and that we all trusted. But, I mean, no religious believer is going to accept that there's like some, you know, in principle we could agree on some like fact checkers. Maybe we don't. But in principle we could agree on like some fact checkers to like figure out which of these sources was right. No religious believer is ever going to accept like some kind of person who gets the authority to decide whether the word of God is true or not. So, you know, it's just going to make it even harder and the conflict in epistemic standards even deeper when religion comes into play, I think.
So a coda to that, it seems like it could be that there is a big capital T truth for some who might have a religious perspective, and that is a more virtuous truth than even the small truths about facts, because it could be a mystery as to why the facts aren't lining up, because there is a larger truth that is more important.
Right, and there are, you know, there are different ways, you know, in which I said at the end, you know, that you should be suspicious of yourself to the extent that, you know, you have these kind of slightly mystifying coincidences. So, you know, you should be suspicious of yourself if the beliefs about matters of fact you're adopting are suspiciously convenient for your values, or if there's a suspicious absence of trade-off. But, of course, if there's a grand divine plan behind the whole thing, certain things that could otherwise look like coincidences don't look like coincidences so much anymore. And there are other ways in which people push back against this kind of thought without bringing in religion too. You know, I mean, I didn't talk in this talk about conspiracy theories, which is another interest of mine, but conspiracy theories have a structure where they say it's almost built into them that they can explain away any evidence against themselves, right? Because any apparent evidence against the conspiracy theory has itself just been planted by the conspirators, right? That's what the conspiracy theory says. So again, they're extremely hard to argue with, right? Because, you know, any evidence that you could produce against the conspiracy theory almost just confirms them, because they're like, oh, well, look, you know, that evidence against the conspiracy theory is what they want you to believe. That's what they've planted to try and make you not realize about the conspiracy. And so it's extremely difficult to argue with them. And, of course, not all religious believers are like that, but sometimes certain kinds of dialogues with a certain kind of religious believer can have the same feel, right, where, you know, anything can be explained away as just being part of the divine mystery.
It's like you're getting you can have people accept an epistemic vice for a metaphysical virtue in a way. All right, we have a question here from Paul Connick. What do you mean by different epistemic standards as applied to the circumstance where people have different interpretations of what the evidence supports? Can't they subscribe to the same analytical and methodological standards and still disagree?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I actually was thinking about this when I was putting these slides together and thinking, do I have a better phrase than different epistemic standards? Because different epistemic standards sort of suggest like very deep differences in the ways that we form beliefs about the world, right? They're something like, just to relate it back to the previous question, something like the disagreement between someone who thinks that the right way to resolve questions is just by reading a religious text versus the right way to resolve questions is by looking at scientific data. That would be a deep difference in epistemic standards. But I do think that the person who asked that question is completely right, that we can sometimes have disagreements about what the evidence supports that don't bottom out in those sorts of ultimate methodological differences. We just have different takes on the evidence. And yeah, I was being a bit loose in using the term conflicting epistemic standards to describe those situations as well, but there is a sense in which those ones are not as deep conflicts of epistemic standards.
I want to open up to the floor. Okay.
Is there any hope? I find the divide, I find the hatred exhausting, and I don't see an end. Is there hope? I mean, how is this tear down the country ever going to resolve? I mean, I kind of feel like it's Northern Ireland.
Yeah. Well, is there any hope? I don't know. I mean, the things I was giving you at the end about navigating the epistemological crisis were, I was trying to give suggestions for individual people. Now, of course, most of America is not currently sitting in this room, and most of America is not following online on Zoom even.
It's their loss.
And even if they were, they wouldn't necessarily listen to me. So I do think there are things that if we all did them would help. I think there are I think if we asked ourselves these questions more about, are my beliefs suspiciously convenient for my values? Is there a suspicion that absence of trade-offs? I do think that would help. Can we expect people to start doing that? Well, that's a different question. And, again, that is kind of above my pay grade as a philosopher. I'm not super optimistic, but, I hope that some of the kinds of work that people in this area are doing, and I'm not the only person doing it, have some kind of trickle-down effect. But, how large would it be? Probably not very large. So, it is, it can be depressing. There was something you said right at the, Northern Ireland. Yeah, that just reminded me. A great point about the politics of Northern Ireland that I remember learning about when I was studying political science as an undergraduate is that because politics in Northern Ireland is so divided by religion, by sectarian religious identity, the elections are almost like a census, right? So they just measure who has which sectarian religious identity, and those numbers change slightly over time. The proportion of Catholics is going up slightly relative to the proportion of Protestants in Northern Ireland over time. Yes, exactly, for reasons that you can probably figure out. And so the idea is that because the political parties just represent different religious groupings, and we never get to the business of politics, really. We never get to the business of debating policies. Because the overwhelming issue is just always, are you a Protestant or a Catholic? Now, it's not quite the same in the US because our different identities include various policy stances within them. But you could imagine a scenario where you know, it just kind of becomes like, are you a member of this tribe or the other tribe, and we don't get to kind of debating the policy issues, and that would be how it would be like Northern Ireland, I think.
I would just go on my high horse and say that the public humanities are one way that we can at least encourage humanistic reflection and dialogue on these important issues, and hopefully we can move the needle a little bit. Okay, Sam Jackson has a question. Isn't there a strong affective, emotional aspect to our beliefs, that we feel good when we encounter a fact consistent with our beliefs and uncomfortable and bad when we encounter a fact that is inconsistent? Is this emotional component more compelling than a purely logical analysis of whether a fact is true?
Yeah, well, I think this is basically very closely related to the phenomenon of cultural cognition that I was talking about, right? So it is that involves you having a certain desire to form a certain belief, and then processing the evidence in a way that will get you to the belief that you want to form. And you know, that I said desire, but you know, the emotions come into that too, and you know, your emotions could be what produce a desire to form a certain belief. And the questioner also touched on the idea of, you know, congruence and wanting to have beliefs that feel psychologically comfortable. And you know, I think one of the reasons that people aren't willing to face down trade-offs is because they just don't like having to face down trade-offs, right? So if you it's just not psychologically comfortable, right? So, you know, life is much easier if, you know, small government is good and climate change isn't happening, right? Life is difficult if small government is good but climate change is happening, right? Then you face a trade-off, and it's psychologically uncomfortable to face down those trade-offs. And so I think that is, you know, for a lot of people, that does make a big difference to their beliefs. But, you know, again, I would just want to stress, like I was saying in the stuff about post-truth, that I don't think it's that they consciously think to themselves, I care more about my emotions than about the facts, or I'm going to be illogical, or something like that, right? You know, they see themselves as processing the evidence. It's and as believing on the basis of evidence. It's just that there are emotions underlying the way in which they do that.
Question from the floor? Anyone on the floor? I have questions coming online as well, but we'll hit our live questions first. Not that those of you out in the ether aren't alive as well.
To say that we have an epistemological crisis implies that things are worse, either in nature or in extent now, than they have been in the past. Mm-hmm. And I know that's more of a historical kind of question, but do you have any views on that?
Yeah, I mean, not really. I mean, I alluded to this briefly, I think, you know, when I said it's kind of a just so story that in the past we disagreed about the values but agreed on the facts, and now we have disagreement about the facts too. I mean, of course, even if we restrict ourselves to the climate change example, you know, the disagreement among ordinary Americans about whether climate change is happening predates, you know, 2016. It is not something that has just happened since the rise of Trumpism and since people started talking about epistemological crises and post-truth and so on. But I do think, and you know, again, I'm not an expert on the social scientific data, but I have heard or seen data that suggests that the disagreement about some of these issues has increased, but also the other aspect of it, and this is true with respect to the climate change example in particular, that the disagreement has become more predicted by partisan affiliation. So although there's, for some time in America, been a lack of consensus about whether anthropogenic climate change was occurring, it was not always the case that the vast majority of people who believed that climate change was not occurring were Republicans, and that the vast majority of people who believe that it is occurring, or that anthropogenic climate change is occurring, were Democrats. Like the extent to which those views line up with partisan political affiliation has, as I understand it, increased over time.
David Scott, I'm going to get to a question from Mal Watlington, but David Scott, I think I want to address this question. Has social media made everyone an expert and no one an expert? And is that maybe affecting our current climate?
Yeah, and again, it's kind of like I was saying at the end, when I said, it is actually okay to be not opinionated about everything. I really think it's like that is something that a lot of people on Twitter have forgotten. So, it's like each person feels like they're someone who has to have a take. Of course, not everyone who uses Twitter is like this, but there's a certain section of group of people on Twitter who think that they really do need to be opinionated about everything, and it could maybe be kind of negligent to not have an opinion about some important political issue. And I think that's to be regretted. Of course, and I'm sure you'll have this discussion when you have Daniel Kreis. Is that next week?
Yes,
Social Media and Democracy, in more detail. There's obviously this trade-off where people hope that the rise of social media would make media more democratic, but then it also has many harms. I'll let Daniel speak to that one.
Opinions are loud, that's true.
Right.
Mal Watlington has a question. Would anyone have the motivation to engage in an argument without the energy generated by cultural cognition?
That's a really nice question. So the thought is maybe we need this kind of cultural cognition in order to get ourselves to care about a political issue, so it has a certain benign effect as well. And I think in an ideal world we would be able to care without cultural cognition. So cultural cognition is where you have the goal of reaching a particular conclusion about something, right? So the original psychologists who discussed motivated reasoning around the 90s distinguish what they call directional goals and accuracy goals. So directional goals are goals to reach a particular conclusion about something, and without regard to whether it's true or false. And accuracy goals are goals to reach an accurate answer to something without regard to what it is. And so, I think it is possible to just really want to know the answer to a question, right? There might be certain questions that are just really important for policy making. And, I hope that it would be an incentive for us to get interested in thinking about those questions, to think, well, this is just an important question for us to resolve, and that we wouldn't need to already have a view about it to be motivated to defend, that we would just think, look, environmental policy is a really important topic, and so we'd better form accurate beliefs about it. Maybe that's idealistic, but I think it is possible to be motivated just by wanting to know the truth about something rather than just by wanting to defend some view that you already come into it with.
Questions from the floor at all? I have a host of questions coming up here, so maybe we'll try to get to them rapid-fire questions and see how quickly you can answer them as well, if we can get through them, right?
We've got like 7 minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So we have our friend Charlie Lehman is out there. Hello, Charlie. I had the privilege of working with Bill Bernbach, one of the giants in advertising, who was also insightful in terms of human motivation. In his view, there are 3 sides to every issue: my side, your side, and the truth. This was predicated on his belief that humans cannot be objective because they always seek an advantage. Comment.
I don't think I would go quite that far. I mean, I think in some disagreements, one side has got the truth. Sorry? Right.
It's always my side, right?
Well, yeah, so firstly, I mean, we should distinguish between saying that one side in the disagreement has a true belief from saying you can be sure of which side that is. So, when we're disagreeing about a matter of fact, a simple question that has a kind of yes or no answer, then, for example, are global temperatures rising? It seems like the available answers are yes and no, and one of those has to be true and one of them has to be false, and so there's no room it's not possible that kind of both sides are wrong if we just characterize their disagreement in that simple way. Of course, if we get into more complex details, it's possible for both sides to be wrong about something, but I don't think it's impossible for one side to be right, although, as I've said in the talk, it's sometimes very difficult to demonstrate that one side is right in a way that will be accessible through reasoning to the other side.
There's something about when you have a belief, if it's taken away from you, you feel somewhat wounded, right? Mm-hmm. And that's this emotional aspect of all of this exchange of information is really an important part of the whole effect on our community.
Right, we're attached to the beliefs that we already have. In general, we're attached to things we already have more than to things that we don't have yet. Loss aversion is how behavioral economists refer to that phenomenon. And I think that goes for beliefs as well as things like, concrete things we own. In fact, there's also some interesting psychological work that suggests that people will actually be motivated to defend beliefs that they are primed to think that they have. So they actually they didn't really believe this thing prior, but the experimenters managed to kind of manipulate them in some way to make them think that that's their point of view, or to suggest that that's their point of view already, and then they find themselves motivated to defend it.
Oh boy, the human brain. Paul Connick, I'm going to try to combine a couple questions here. First, he asked, with regard to there being, quote, neutral methods of resolving disagreements, end quote, he wonders if you're familiar with Jonathan Rout's The Constitution of Knowledge and what do you think of it? And he also asked for maybe some books on this topic that you could recommend on the topic of I guess, epistemic knowledge.
Epistemic crisis and so on, yeah. So, the Constitution of Knowledge book, I've heard a lot about it. I haven't read it yet. I hope to, is the brief answer. In terms of stuff to recommend on this, I'm not sure if I have anything to recommend that is like specifically on the topic of America's epistemic crisis that is book length. But one person who has written some really good accessible books for the general public on epistemology is Michael Lynch. His latest book is called Know-It-All Society, I think, and the book before that is called The Internet of Us. There's also a great book by Nathan Ballantyne called Knowing Our Limits that is about this thing that happens to be up here right now, epistemic humility. So off the top of my head, those are a couple of recommendations that are at least in this ballpark. But I'm myself in the process of, I'm working on really a textbook on these topics actually, but it's designed to be also accessible to non-students as well as students. So look out for it in a couple of years' time.
Our audience are great students. I'm sure they'll be interested. We have about 2 minutes left. Any questions from the audience? Final questions? Our dear friend Paul Connick has no shortage of questions, so I can certainly go back to Paul. He just wants a little bit of, where is it, the clarification on epistemic virtue. Can you address the notion of epistemic virtue, a sort of intersection between epistemology and ethics? So what is the ethical component of epistemic virtue?
Right. So virtues are just good character traits or something like that, right? So, well, I'm sure that's extremely philosophically controversial, what I've said already, but that's something like what they are, is good character traits. And so there are certain practical virtues like courage and honesty and moderation and things like that. And then it's been thought for a very long time, I mean, since ancient philosophers, that there are also distinctive intellectual virtues. And humility, epistemic humility might be one of them, right? Knowing your own limits, recognizing your own limits. So, I think those things are about, the sort of epistemological side is more how to form beliefs, and the ethical side is more how to act and what to do. There's a ton of really interesting current philosophical work on how those questions interact and whether we can morally evaluate, I haven't touched on any of this today, but whether we can morally evaluate certain beliefs. So whether beliefs can be not just justified or unjustified, rational or irrational, but moral or immoral, whether there are immoral beliefs, or whether in some ways ethics or morality affects what it's epistemically rational to believe. There's a ton of great philosophical work on that too, which if the person asking the question is interested, they can write to me, and I'm happy to provide some suggestions.
I got a second thing from Paul saying he already answered it in the lecture, so this is just add-on. So let's put our hands together for Dr. Alex Worsnip. That's fantastic, and I want to just remind you folks of some upcoming programs. Again, Humanities in Action next week. As Alex mentioned, we'll be doing Daniel Kreis. He'll be coming and doing social media and democracy. And a special program I didn't mention at the beginning of our program. Next Thursday night, we'll have Claude Clegg here has written his new book, a biography of Barack Obama, and it is a book launch event. If you would like to attend and get a copy of the book, you sign up here at Flyleaf Books. If you'd like to attend the virtual screening, Paul is putting information in our chat, and that's available. You can access it virtual as well, and we'll be right up here on the stage interviewing Claude about his book, and it should be absolutely fascinating. That's next Thursday, October 14th. Again, Lunch with Friends and Strangers on Friday, Kamel Ataturk and Shamil Aydin, and we'll bring back into the screen one more time. So put our hands together for Alex Worsnip. Much appreciated. We'll see you all next time, folks, and thank you for coming, and check us out, humanities.unc.edu. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.